Reading The Unknown Reality by Jane Roberts, a Seth book, Volume 2. Okay, so reading session 742, and Seth is going to bring up Atlantis during dictation, but also you're going to want to stick around for the end post-session notes because there are excellent Atlantis dictation notes. So definitely stick around for the whole video if you can on this particular recording. It's going to be really awesome. Alright, so Seth starts off his dictation by stating, he says, the whole idea of probable realities seems strange or esoteric only because you are not used to following your own thought processes. You shut them off any time they do not conform to current beliefs about the nature of the self or about reality in general. The deepest meanings of probabilities lie, however, precisely in their psychological import. You have become so hypnotized by a one-level kind of thought that anything else seems impractical. You concentrate upon those decisions that you make and disregard the processes involved. This has been carried to an extreme. You see, often you are so disconnected from those inner workings that your own decisions then appear to come from someplace else. You may be convinced that events happen to you and are beyond your control, simply because you are so out of touch with yourself that you never catch the moments of your own decisions. Then you feel as if you are the pawns of fate, and the idea of probable actions seem like the sheerest nonsense. Each event seems inevitable. If this attitude is carried to excessive lengths, then it even appears that you have no hand at all in the making of your own reality. You will always feel yourself a victim. The unknown reality is your psychic, spiritual, and psychological one, and from it your physical experience springs. That inner, all-pervasive existence becomes known to the extent that you grow more responsive to your own inner environment. This does not mean that you become entirely self-centered, blind to the rest of the world. It does not mean that you must meditate for hours or study your own thought processes with such vigor that you ignore other activities. It simply means that you are aware of your own life as clearly as possible, in touch with your thought processes, aware of them but without overdue concern or over-analysis. They are as much a part of your inner environment as trees are of your exterior world. There are different species of selves in the same fashion. There are different species of worlds. When you identify with only one particular level of your thought processes, however, the others, when you sense them, appear alien. You begin to feel threatened, determined to uphold your old ideas of selfhood. Plants grow many leaves. One leaf does not threaten the existence of others, and the plant is not jealous of its own foliage. So there is no need to protect your own individuality because it may send out other shoots into probable realities. This is simply the self growing in different directions, spreading its seeds. Joseph and Rupert have moved into a quote-unquote new house. In so doing, they have traveled through probabilities, as each of my readers has under similar circumstances. They identify with the selves who moved into the new, quote, hill house, end quote. In a sense, they are different people now than they were when unknown reality began, some 14 months ago. However, Many of my readers are also different people now than they were when they began to read this work. Let us go back approximately 2 months in your time. Rupert and Joseph were looking for a house. They had already seen one on the inside, as mentioned earlier. This manuscript, for that matter, has begun precisely at the point in time that Rupert's and Joseph's latest adventures with Probabilities began. 2 months ago, however, they were attracted to the Foster Avenue house, as they called it. They drove past it often and went inside. Rupert imagined his classes being held there. Imaginatively, both Rupert and Joseph saw themselves living there, and a certain amount of psychic energy was projected into that house. In a probable reality, a Rupert and Joseph now live there. In the world that you recognize as official, however, they moved into the Hill House. To some extent, both of them are aware of the inner processes involved in the final decision. I do not mean that they are simply familiar with the exterior thought processes involved, such as, quote, the Hill House is better constructed, end quote, or, quote, it has a fine view, end quote. I am speaking of deeper mechanisms of consideration, in which correlations are made between interior and exterior realities. It is obvious that when you move from one place to another, you make an alteration in space, but you alter time as well, and you set into motion a certain psychological impetus that reaches out to affect everyone you know. When a house is vacant, all of the people in the neighborhood send out their own messages. To a certain extent, any given inhabited area forms its own quote-unquote entity. This applies to the smallest neighborhood and to the greatest nation. Such messages are often encountered in the dream state. Empty houses are psychic vacancies that yearn to be filled. When you move into other portions of your own selfhood. In fact, you move into new areas of the self all of the time. The species is now entering such a phase, a period in which it will come more into its own. Mankind will be entering into its own new house then, but the physical changes will be the result of interior ones and alterations in main lines of probabilities. Christian theology sees the end of the world in certain terms, with a grand God coming to reward the good and to punish the wicked. That system of belief allows for no other probability. Some see the end of the world coming as a greater disaster or envision man finally ruining his planet. Others see periods of peace and advance, and each probability will happen, quote-unquote, somewhere. However, many of my readers, or their offspring, will be involved in a new dimension of selfhood, in which consciousness is fully explored and the potentials of the soul uncovered, at least to some extent. Human capabilities will be seen as what they are, and a great new period of development will occur, in which all concepts of selfhood and reality will be literally seen as, quote, primitive superstition, end quote. The species will actually move into a new kind of selfhood. Theories of probabilities will be seen as practical, workable, psychological facts, giving leeway and freedom to the individual, who will no longer feel at the mercy of external events, but will realize instead that he or she is the initiator. Now, you squeeze the grapefruit of your selfhood into a tiny, uneasy pulp, unaware of the sweetness of its juices or the variety of its seasons. You look at the outsides of yourselves as if a peach were aware only of its skin. In the reality I foresee, however, people will become familiar with far greater aspects of themselves and bring these into actualization. They will be in touch with their own decisions as they make them. If they become ill, they will do so knowing they choose the condition in order to emphasize certain areas of development or to minimize others. They will be aware of their own options consciously. The great strength and resiliency of the body will be much better understood, not because medical science makes spectacular discoveries, though it will, but because the mind's alliance with the body will be seen more clearly. In this probability of which I speak, the species will begin to encounter the great challenge inherent in fulfilling the vast, untouched potential of the human body and mind. In that probable reality to which each of you can belong to some extent, each person will recognize his or her inherent power of action and decision, and feel an individual sense of belonging with the physical world that springs up in response to individual desire and belief. Okay, pausing real quick before I go into Atlantis. Rob said that he labeled this the session as the end of the world. So far, it sounds like it's really the beginning of the world. And we're already in it, right? We've already seen it. We see it. I see it. I see it. This transition, this transformation is already happening. And I think it's awesome. I think it's great. So here we go. We're going into Atlantis, you guys. So pay attention. And remember, there's going to be more in the post-session notes. So you guys have to stick around. You will not want to miss this information. Okay, so Seth states, your ideas of Atlantis are partially composed of future memories. They are psychic yearnings toward the ideal civilization, patterns within the psyche, even as each fetus has within it the picture of its own most ideal fulfillment toward which it grows. Atlantis is a land that you want to inhabit, appearing in your literature, your dreams, and your fantasies, serving as an impetus for development. It is real and valid. In your terms, it is not, quote-unquote, yet physical fact, but in some ways it is more real than any physical fact, for it is a psychic blueprint. It also carries, however, the imprint of your fears, for the tales say that Atlantis was destroyed. You place it in your past while it exists in your future. Not the destruction alone, but the entire pattern seen through the framework of your beliefs. Beside this, however, many civilizations have come and gone in somewhat the same manner, and the quote-unquote myth of Atlantis is based somewhat then on physical fact in your terms. The species then moves into its own new houses. Atlantis is the story of a future probability projected backward into an apparent past. Your planet, as you know it, is a certain kind of focus point for consciousness. At your level, you think it is divided into areas of land and water, continents and oceans, islands and peninsulas, cities and woods, because that is all you perceive. Your consciousness is tuned into frequencies of perception that give you that impression. A cat's world, or an insect's, or a plant's, are each far different, yet equally valid. As simply as I can explain it, your planet is also quote-unquote divided into time and probability areas. So many civilizations exist at once then, and there are certain bleed-throughs. In your terms, some civilizations are real and perceivable, and some are not. Alright, so that is where Seth ends dictation for that night. But right here, Jane says that she doesn't know why, but sometimes she thinks that it's a tremendous strain to do this, have these sessions and so forth. But she's determined to explore the reality as much as she can, to get all she can out of it. And sometimes she thinks there's nothing to it. Everyone has their hassles, she says. So why should I have any more or less? I really think I have less trouble than a lot of people. So there's more information that Rob inserts right here. And you can pause and read that paragraph. And then pause and read this paragraph. There's not enough time for me to read all of this. There's really important information. Do not turn off your phones or your laptops. Guys, do not turn them off yet. Okay, so right here Rob inserts that from chapter 22, session 588 from the book Seth Speaks. Seth comments that he says, I was born in Atlantis. Okay, I'll put that link if I haven't already. I need to look at my notes. But Rob also adds right here, he says, after this evening's session, we decided we'd like to know why, in Seth's view, Atlantis had moved from its long, if uneasy residence in our, quote, historical past, end quote, forward into a future probable reality. We resolved to ask him to explain. But strangely enough, I note later, a month passed before we got around to a session on the subject. By then, Seth had been through with unknown reality for 3 weeks. Now, I refer the reader to note 11 here in these notes you're about to hear for quotations from the session, the 747th in question. So Seth will talk about it right here. Give me a sec. Alright, so first of all, there's other great information here. So note number 1, post-session notes. Rob states, this is a good place to insert these excerpts from the session Seth gave for ESP class, February 16, 1971, 3 years before starting Unknown Reality. While it leads to a number of questions, his material still sums up certain important meanings that lie behind or within the overall concept of probable realities. Okay, so here's Seth. He states, quote, you call this your universe and your reality, and it is indeed, for you form it. Within you also is the knowledge of other great experiments that are being tried, just as other probable systems are aware of the experiments you are involved with. I am speaking in your terms only, which means that to some extent I am hedging, but other civilizations have gone your route. Some have failed, but the inhabitants of some Earths have succeeded very well. As you think of it, your future is not set. You can follow any road you choose, but until you realize that as individuals you each form your own personal life and have a part in the mass creation of reality, there is much learning ahead for you. This is a lesson you are meant to fully understand within physical reality. You are meant to judge physical reality. You are meant to realize that it is a materialization of your thoughts and feelings and images, that the inner self forms that world. In your terms, you cannot be allowed to go into other dimensions until you have learned the great power of your thoughts and subjective feelings. So even when you think you destroy nothing. And when you think you kill nothing. When you imagine that you can annihilate a reality, you can only assault it as you know it. The reality itself will continue to exist. Because you cannot follow a thought, you wonder where it has gone. Has it fallen off some invisible cliff in your mind? But because you can no longer hold that thought in consciousness does not mean it no longer exists, that it does not have a reality of its own, for it does indeed. And if a world escapes you, if you cannot follow it and think it has been destroyed, then the same thing applies to the world as to the thought. It continues to live. Now, what I have said should inspire questions within you. Awesome end quote by Seth there. Okay, so Rob adds right here, much in these passages fits in with material I've presented in Appendix 12 on the reasons behind the pain and suffering in the world. Earlier in that appendix, then, see the quotations from the 580th session for Chapter 20 of Seth Speaks, and from the 634th session for Chapter 8 of The Nature of Personal Reality. Okay, so going to note 7, Rob states, naturally, Seth's discussion since break reflects much of his material throughout The Nature of Personal Reality. That book, you guys, go to Tim Hart's channel and just listen to the whole freaking book if you haven't listened to it already. It is inspiring. Okay, it'll help you so much if you haven't heard it. Okay, so anyways, Rob goes on. He says, then, in Volume 1, see his comments just before 1126 for the 687th session. And Rob inserts a Seth quote here from that session stating, quote, I am saying that the individual self must become consciously aware of far more reality. Your species is in a time of change. There are potentials within the body's mechanisms in your terms, not as yet used. Developed, they can immeasurably enrich the species. If some changes are not made, the species as such will not endure. End quote. Dang, right? Okay. Such an important session here. Okay, so session note number 8, when Appendix 14 is ready on the quote-unquote fantasies or quote dreams and literature and quote of Atlantis, I will read that in Appendix 14, which I will be getting to very soon. Going to note 11. Alright, here's our note on Atlantis. You guys can pause and read this information right here that Rob's noting. And pause and read the first paragraph right there if you'd like. But I'm just going to go right into what Seth says here. From session 747, after this freaking book was done. Okay, so Seth states, Atlantis. First of all, take it for granted, as you do, that your ideas about the age of the earth are erroneous. There were intelligent human beings far earlier than is supposed. And because you assume a one-line kind of progression from an ape-like creature to man, you ignore any evidence that shows to the contrary. There were highly developed human beings with elaborate civilizations, existing simultaneously with what you might call animal kingdoms. That is, more or less organized primeval animal tribes, possessing their own kinds of quote-unquote primitive cultures. Those animal kingdoms, some of them utilized tools. Their senses were extremely acute, and their quote-unquote cultures dealt with a kind of transmission of knowledge that made a highly complicated vocabulary unnecessary. Those species did not vie for domination of the earth, but simply shared the same general environment with the more sophisticated groupings beyond their own perimeters. There were many highly technical human cultures, but in your terms, not on a global scale. The legend of Atlantis is actually based upon several such civilizations. No particular civilization is the basis, however. Apart from that, the legend as picked up, so to speak, by Plato was a precognition of the future probability, an image of an inner civilization of the mind actually projected outward into the future, where it would be used as a blueprint. The lost grandeur, as in other terms, Eden became the lost garden of paradise. Rupert has implied in his novel The Education of Oversoul 7 that some archaeological discoveries about the past are not discovered in your present because they do not exist yet. Now, such concepts are difficult to explain in my kind of prose and in your language, but in certain terms, the ruins of Atlantis have not been found because they have not been placed in your past yet from the future. Now, the future is probable. However, in your terms, there are ruins of the civilizations that served as the quote-unquote concrete basis for the one Atlantean legend. Those civilizations were scattered. The so-called ruins would not be found in any one place as expected, therefore. There are some beneath the Aegean Sea and some beneath an offshoot of the Atlantic, and some beneath the Arctic, for the world had a different shape. In far greater terms, at the risk of repeating myself, time is simultaneous, so those civilizations exist along with your own. Your methods of dating the age of the Earth are very misleading. In your terms, from your present, you quote-unquote plant images, tales, legends, quote, at any given time, end quote, that seem to come from the past, but are actually like ghost images from the future, for you to follow or disregard as you choose. Atlantis and the Garden of Eden are the same in that regard. When you think that perhaps your species came from another planetary system, in time terms, then of course you are still dealing with old concepts. In your usual terms of thinking, the Earth does not exist at all. Not if you are considering it as a chunk of matter occupying a certain position in a physical cosmos. It is really futile to question whether the universe came from a big boom, or is constantly expanding, though in those terms I have said it continually expands as an idea or a dream does. I am not saying the universe does not exist, only that it does not exist in the way that it seems to you. By itself, the truth of the matter is far more spectacular. All that is creates its reality as it goes along. Each world has its own impetus, yet all are ultimately connected. The true dimensions of a divine creativity would be unendurable for any one consciousness of whatever import. And so that splendor is infinitely dimensionalized, worlds spiraling outward with each quote-unquote moment of a cosmic breath, with the separation of worlds a necessity, and with individual and mass comprehension always growing at such a rate that all that is multiplies itself at microseconds, building both pasts and futures and other timescales you do not recognize. Each is a reality in itself, with its own potentials and with no individual consciousness, however minute, ever lost. In that kind of framework, how can I explain an Atlantis? It exists both in your past and future, a probable world that some of you will choose from a model placed in the past of your future, partially based upon fact in your terms, but with its greatest validity lying in its possibilities. End quote by Seth. Okay, so I suggest that you guys listen to that again. Literally again. If you don't have the book, listen to that video again, this video again. So, yeah, that's the end of that session. And next session, 743. Seth wraps up the book. What he hopes to have taught is what I wrote. Let's see what Rob says. Okay, session 743, next video. Much better. Rob says, quote, a quote from Seth, of course, quote, "You are the unknown reality," end quote. So we have that to look forward to. And just remember that even though there's 2 more sessions left, I have to read the appendixes. And not just this appendix, but volume 1s as well, because nobody else has done it. And there's so much good information in these appendixes. So you guys have that to look forward to, as do I. Alright, so thank you for watching. Subscribe, share, comment, and much love.